there will be hearing me and answer my call to proceed from the outside back into this room so that we can, in the next few minutes, begin the fourth plenary session of this year's IISS Manama Dialogue. Everyone will have had a substantial lunch break, so every reason to have been reinvigorated to return for this plenary. I'll wait another minute and a half or so and then warn people that we will begin pretty much on time. Well, thank you very much. I think we'll shortly begin, and when the message gets out that we've begun, I know people will move quickly back into the hall. The fourth plenary session at this year's Manama Dialogue is on the theme conflicts and coalitions in the Middle East. And a feature of the last 12 months has been both the multiplication of conflicts and therefore, to a degree, the multiplication of coalitions, alliances of the willing, ad hoc partnerships, as one foreign minister described it this morning, in order to grapple with these issues. In Vienna yesterday, of course, many foreign ministers met to see if a genuinely collective design could be placed on the in principle, universal will to bring an early end to these conflicts that are plaguing the region so that the people and governments of the region can concentrate on building prosperity for their peoples. And we have very important representatives, both of their countries and of their regions, here today to speak to us. First, Dr. Ursula von der Leyen, who is the Minister of Defense of the Federal Republic of Germany. She was first inaugurated in the ISS practice of conducting international dialogues earlier this year when she attended the IISS Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore and gave a very compelling address on the way in which Germany and indeed Europe looks forward to engaging with the economically dynamic and pluralistic Asia-Pacific region. And here she is today to deliver an address to us on how Germany and indeed the European continent hopes to engage with the Middle East and needs to engage with the Middle East because of the fact that the domestic politics of the Middle East have almost become the domestic politics of the countries of the European Union, and particularly in recent weeks of our own country, Germany. And we have also here with us today the Minister of Defense of the Arab Republic of Iraq that is joined up now often with Syria when people talk about conflicts in the Middle East and talk about the fact that tragically, Iraq and Syria have almost become a single battleground. So transnational has been the efforts of militias and non-state actors to operate across this space in which, of course, the so-called Islamic State has sought to establish a caliphate. And the nature of diplomatic relations and of defense diplomacy in today's world is such that these two ministers only met 2.5 days ago in Iraq and had a very successful one-hour meeting, and it's a delight that 2.5 days later they find themselves here both again to share this podium. So with that preface and introduction, it really is a great pleasure to invite Dr. Ursula von der Leyen to address the fourth plenary of the IISS Manama Dialogue.
Thank you very much, John, and congratulations to the IISS for this remarkable conference. And I want to thank you for the invitation to this conference because it gives me the chance to visit the beautiful kingdom of Bahrain, to spend a few days in a region that is famous as a cradle of civilization, and of course to present to you a German view, or better, a European view on conflicts and coalitions in this part of the world. Yes, we have too many violent conflicts, and we have far too few coalitions to stop or control them. The conflicts sum up in a way that regional order seems to be collapsing. The forces of fragmentation, disorder, and terror seem to be stronger than those seeking stability, diversity, and peace. I want to emphasize, we in Europe are not simply spectators. We are struck by terror alike. The attacks in France, in Belgium. We're facing thousands of European foreign fighters in Syria and Iraq. We are shocked by thousands of dead bodies washed to the shores of Italy and Greece. And hundreds of thousands of refugees are knocking on our door to find shelter. And therefore, these conflicts have become ours as well. They matter to us. Ladies and gentlemen, I see three core interests which we share with our neighbors in the Middle East and the Arab world. First of all, we have to fight terror, be it Daesh or regional groups of Al-Qaeda. It's a phenomenon we have to fight, not only military-wise, but mostly politically and ideologically. Second, we have to reinstate order, economic development, and stability in countries like Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, or Libya, because this is the precondition for the third shared common interest, to give the people of those countries a perspective again for security, prosperity, and a life and dignity in their home countries. And therefore, allow me to be clear, this is not just another critical moment. This is more. we experience a decisive moment in our common history. Europe is engaged, so is my government. German diplomacy is trying to get conflicting forces to the negotiation table. We support countries like Jordan or Turkey, who host an enormous number of refugees. We try to strengthen courageous societies like Tunisia, and we support vulnerable societies like Afghanistan, including their security architecture. We give, in those days, hundreds of thousands of refugees shelter. German soldiers are in the northern Iraq. There's a growing cooperation with the central government of Iraq. We are investing heavily in the humanitarian assistance in Iraq, and we will be investing in stabilization. Our Navy is patrolling the shores of Lebanon and rescuing refugees and fighting smugglers in the Mediterranean Sea. We're training armed forces in Somalia and Mali, and we are carrying the responsibility for the Resolute Support mission in the northern part of Afghanistan. I do very well know that our engagement alone will not lead to a solution. Granted, there are coalitions. Arab countries are trying to restore stability in Yemen. Yesterday, 15 nations met in Vienna because of Syria. Under the umbrella of the United Nations, many care for Libya. And there is the broad coalition against Daesh. Yet, is it enough? Given the scope of the overwhelming challenge, I pledge for a new partnership of dedication that is not only coalitions point to point, but a joint political will, an overarching understanding whom to fight, but also whom to protect, a common effort to foster economic development and to nourish solidarity with millions who suffer. We all have to ask ourselves, do we take a fair share of the burden? The answer certainly will have to be manifold. Determination to fight any kind of terror, militarily, politically, and ideologically. Exercise more support with those countries hosting millions of refugees, like Jordan, Lebanon, or Turkey. A profound engagement for the stabilization and nation building of Syria and Iraq. And most important, create hope and perspective for refugees to return home, including respect for human dignity and human rights. And last but not least, ladies and gentlemen, we have to counter those who nourish conflicts and terror. We can counter them by standing united, sending a strong message of a unanimous political will, and by giving visibility to our common narrative. In short, a partnership of dedication. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Minister. And I think very many people will have been struck by your phrase that we don't want coalitions point to point, as it were, and also your invocation of, I think, the very evocative phrase that we need to know who to defeat and also who to protect. And I know there will be very many questions in the audience about the way in which Germany and indeed the European Union have sought to grapple with the urgent refugee crisis that these conflicts, principally but not only in the Middle East, have created for the continent. It's now my great pleasure to invite to the podium the Minister of Defense of Iraq. He will speak in Arabic, so those of you who are not confident in that language might prepare their headsets in order to hear every word that he says. Thank you very much.
شكرا جزيلا للجميع، والشكر موصول أيضا للقائمين على المؤتمر لإتاحة هذه الفرصة الطيبة للحديث بهذا المؤتمر المهم.
Very important conference. First of all, I apologize for my speech that might be a bit long because I have to tackle a lot of subjects, and I will be very clear and frank and sincere in my way of talking. I will talk about what already happened and what will happen in Iraq and Syria. In the name of God, the Almighty, the Merciful. From the tentacles of a war, on the beats of the crisis, and on a road burdened by differences, Iraqis come to you. They have paid a heavy price with their blood and resources. I transmit to you the regards of the Iraqi people and government. I transmit to you a message of love and peace to you and your people, a call of hope that Iraq and its people will be on your agendas and plannings to serve their interests before your aspirations, to be on your mind that rather than a source of concern or fear. Dear friends, it's an honor for me to be among you to tackle the strategic approaches of my country, Iraq, of human-made concerns, and our brotherly country, Syria. On the level of the state and on the level of history, let us tackle an approach that go beyond stating the evidence, stating the obvious, and that go also beyond decision makers. I will talk about what we can do as people after all what happened and all what might happen. It is crucial to adopt very clear norms and standards concerning Iraq and Syria in order to overcome the complexity, the ambiguity, and the versatility of what is happening and of the political internal contradictions that we are living. We need objective approaches for these two countries who are facing common challenges, regardless of the differences in their regimes. The two countries have an intricate memory. They also have a similarity of challenges. However, from an intellectual point of view or from an intellectual perspective, it would seem that the attitude of both Iraq and Syria is feeding off the challenges that the other country is living. And that is also nourished by the challenges that are emerging on the international scene, like the invasion of Iraq. All this calls for a deep vision in order to decipher all that is happening. We have to look at what is actually happening, and we have to realize that what is happening is stemming from the lack of vision of our decision maker. If we look closely at the common challenges facing the country and how these challenges aim at hindering the historical existence of both Syria and Iraq, we realize that the decision makers or the two countries are overseeing the consequences that both are going to face. The Arab Spring, the terrorism, Daesh, have changed the history of both countries and even the geography of both countries. However, these challenges have provided these countries with a chance to overcome their personal interests and their personal gains. Dear friends, history is not made by regimes. It is made by people, by living people. The self-determination cannot be built on personal interests. It can only be built on very courageous decisions. We will not oversee for 1 minute what our inaction can lead to, like the decline of a country or the destruction of a country. We need to find a truth, a historical truth with ourselves in order to decide what will destiny will look like after showing so many failures.
Perhaps the first obligation is to thoroughly look at what's going on in Iraq and Syria. Intertwined events, protracted wars. It is one battle of operation, different sectarian strife and nationalistic problems to the extent that we have forgotten all about democracy and good governance. In light of the intertwined crises and challenges, we are always waiting the next crisis to come, hoping for each crisis to settle the one that would come after it. We have lost our path in determining our future direction. I know that what I'm saying are heavy words, but undoubtedly this is no empty rhetoric, and it aims at promoting the proper way of thinking in order to be proactive in dealing with incidents, especially in light of what's going on in Iraq and Syria, as well as the different sequelae of these events. Therefore, when we adopt a normative vision of what's going on and we consider the future of both countries, we need to base our work on three main approaches that are linked to other sub-approaches. The historical approach first. This history of both countries refer to the joint management of their affairs, starting by Sykes-Picot to the latest governance mechanisms in both countries between nationalistic movements and the martial rule, as well as the relationship with the Arab-Israeli conflict and the problem of 1991, as well as the time when the entire equation shifted in 2003, when Iraq, that was a model of democracy through democracy in spite of its shortcomings, and Syria attempted to promote resistance through instability. The objective or purpose-based approach, Iraq is seeking to reassure its internal scene against terrorism and to reconstruct its state, whereas Syria has adopted specific policies and choices in order to benefit from the Iraqi situation to the fullest. And based on a hope to acquire what is impossible, whereas what was possible was easily achievable. It is a historical paradox that soon led to a situation where Syria was targeted itself. Instead of pushing all parties into war inside Iraq alone, it was the turn of Syria, where Syria found itself confronted with a true plight. In spite of all of that, at the geostrategic and operational level, Syria became an additional burden for Iraq, and both parties remained taken by the internal conflicts and their repercussions in both countries. It's quite unfortunate that the leadership in Syria did not learn from the Iraqi experience and saw that its interest was elsewhere and that reality was inexistent. As a result, the Iraqi scene became a cradle of extremism, terrorism, the exploitation of confessional strife, instigation, and terrorism funding, all of which were not part of the strategic calculations and reflected a true mistaken strategic vision. This is why we consider that the common security structure is an extension of the integrity of the geographic land, and we will always have a domino effect in the region, as the presence of the Nusra Front and ISIS in Syria is related to their presence in Iraq as well as in Libya and Egypt. In light of this reality, we need to adopt historically inspired approaches in order to confront ISIS and to overcome the routine events That would be our only alternative to preserve our country from external interference in order to manage our own internal security affairs. I will present you with some pieces of information that support what I'm saying. Since June 2014, Iraq and Syria have been a single stage for the threat of ISIS that was only halted by the international interference on the ground. ISIS has been gaining leverage to the east as well as to the south, and it was only confronted by the international forces. To the west, it was confronted by the Russian presence in Syria, and it was assisted by other regional forces which prevented it from reaching the Mediterranean. It became clear that the different regional measures led to interference under different types of pretext, knowing that some still believe in the hypothesis of exploiting ISIS to benefit from its repercussions for the interest of this party or that party, forgetting or overlooking that the plight of ISIL, if ever it overtakes Iraq and Syria, will swipe over the entire or through the entire region, and then there will be no time for regrets. Thirdly, the strategic approach. By looking at the different events, the current hypothesis that says that we have to look back at the root causes of each plight to solve it is no longer valid. This is a strategic description, especially after the international forces were unable to promote coordination mechanisms in order to solve the crisis in both countries. ISIS cannot be simply defeated militarily in Iraq and Syria. This should be coupled with other ideological, media, economic and social efforts in order to confront ISIS in both countries, at the regional and at the Middle East level. Otherwise, the solution will remain a mirage that has no concrete impact on the ground, and its repercussions will be translated into ongoing instability with deep repercussions. In addition, we need to have other approaches that would dissociate and differentiate between Iraq and Syria. Today, Iraq is based on a federation regime and a permanent constitution. It represents all internal national factions. Of course, there are perhaps some remarks and comments to make about Iraq's recent attempt. However, by promoting the nationalistic viewpoint and the common ground between Iraqis at the level of the leadership and decision makers, we are reaching greater levels of stability. I would like to note in this regard that what's going on in Iraq and Syria has the same type of political description, and this is quite concerning, as political inputs between both countries are quite different, and basing ourselves on the hypothesis of marginalization and exclusion that's having its repercussions regionally in Iraq will support the terrorist groups in practice without being a motive for stability in the outskirts of Iraq. Ladies and gentlemen, it's no secret that we have great concerns about what's going on in Syria. The situation in Syria hasn't got much support for any internal political solution without having the proper regional and international support that would take us back to a single level playing field and to move towards a single political truce in light of the complicated demographic construct of the Syrian society. Otherwise, we will always have new fertile grounds for terrorism in Syria, outside it as well, especially in Iraq. The establishment of defense arrangements in the Middle East will not happen in a spontaneous manner. We're aware of that, but we're also aware that there is a possibility to achieve this. The best possibility is by annihilating Daesh or ISIS, which is consistent with the need to establish a defense dialogue mechanism between the different armies and institutions of the regions in order to establish strategic coalitions that have become a necessity, not simply a choice. So, ending the root causes of terrorism is what is needed. This requires comprehensive and integrated approaches and tools, a single language, a single security and military construct in order to manage operations beyond borders, beyond regional waters, to deal with the problem of refugees, to reconstruct the destroyed and the freed regions from the danger of ISIS. We also consider that reaching a mature convention against terrorism between the different Gulf countries will be the cornerstone for establishing a single defense strategy in the Middle East region. Our common plight, even though we are spearheading it and we are paying the price of it through our blood and our resources, has led us to consider a single defense strategy in order to redress things even at the level of the possible. This would be the first step to come out victorious against ISIS. It all starts with awareness, especially by being aware of what we want in reality and in the future. Keeping faith in the future is a necessity of life. It is in our hands. It's not impossible. A common vision, our will, and our good governance will allow us to succeed and will be our road to salvation. I would like to seize this opportunity to extend my thanks to the organizers of this conference, as well as the government and people of the Brethren Kingdom of Bahrain. May God's praise and blessings be upon you all.
And I think in the last couple of minutes, people will have been struck by your very specific proposal following your call for a comprehensive approach to problems in the region, your specific call for a defense dialogue between armies of the region in order to arrive at a single defense strategy. So that's quite an extraordinary call, a challenge to which a number will have to rise, a defense dialogue between armies of the region to arrive at a single defense strategy. There are a couple of present and former military officers in the region, and I would invite them to take that bait and see if any of them have a suggestion to make in response to the Minister's proposal. We're now open to the floor. I've got 5 or 6 people. I recall that you need to put your card in and press the button. The light will turn green, but we'll turn the microphone on when we've recognized you. And I think it's important at this stage perhaps to have a point of view from Russia. And so the first person I'll ask to take the floor is Maxim Shevovolenko.
Thank you. I have 2 questions for both ministers. My first question goes to Ms. Ursula von der Leyen. This is about to what extent can the German experience of participation in the Normandy 4 be instrumental or, on the contrary, frustrating in mediating internal conflicts in countries like Syria, Iraq, and perhaps Yemen, as it was in the case of Ukrainian crisis? And my second question is for Minister Khalid Al-Waidi, and that is, what is the unique Iraqi experience so far of participating in both coalitions, the US-led and the 4, that of Iraq, Iran, Russia, and Syria, in fighting Daesh? And what are the positive and negative aspects of this? And what are the likely prospects? Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll take 6 or 7 and then come back to the panel. The next from Germany, Dr. Florence Gaub.
Minister, I am particularly glad to see you here this year. It's my 4th time at the Manama Dialogue, and every year as a German citizen I was sad to see that the highest level from Germany was not so present here in the Gulf. So you being here for me sends the message, and you underlined that in your speech very much, that Germany has woken up to the so-called Gulf moment. Allow me, however, to be a little bit provocative. A few years ago, when I was still working at NATO, we were seeking foreign officers from Germany to come to NATO's Middle East faculty, and we were told, I quote, the Middle East is not a region of strategic importance to Germany. Clearly this has changed, but is Germany picking the cherries out of the cake when it comes to conflict and war? When you think of Libya in 2011, I think there is a bit of the impression at the international level that Germans only participate in those aspects of war and conflict that it can reconcile with its history and its popular mood back home. How do you reconcile that? Thank you.
Thank you, John. I'd like to amplify the very useful question from the Russian delegate and ask specifically about Iran. Many speakers this morning saw Iran's role in Syria as entirely negative. And in Iraq, it's my assessment that Daesh was stopped in its tracks last year as much by the mass mobilization of popular militias as by the coalition airstrikes. But many commentators believe those militias are now more influenced by Iran than by the Iraqi government, and that in many respects they play a negative role. I'd like to ask both speakers if they agree.
Thank you very much. Josh Rogan.
Thank you very much. My question is a follow-up for the Iraqi defense minister. As was just mentioned, it's a concern in the West, especially in Washington, that popular militia forces have taken an outsized role in securing Iraqi security, in securing Iraq. There's concern in Washington because some of these militias have records of human rights abuses and even terrorism. There's also a concern that these militias are integrated into the top levels of the Iraqi security forces and the Iraqi government. My question is, does the Iraqi government control these Iranian-backed militias, or is it the other way around?
Thank you very much. I'll take one more in this round from the UK, Toby Dodge.
Thank you, John. My question is also to Minister Obeidi. It's a pleasure to see him on the platform here at Manama. I just wanted to ask you about the progress towards building a National Guard. Firstly, whether the plans for the National Guard had actually survived the passage of the bill through Parliament. To what extent did parliamentary scrutiny damage the coherence of that? And secondly, to what extent you think the National Guard can act as both a vehicle for reconciliation in Iraq, but also a vehicle for the decentralization of power away from Baghdad?
Thank you very much. I think I'll return now to the panel and ask Ursula von der Leyen to answer the questions first about the Normandy 4, Germany and the Middle East, militias, and then turn to the Iraqi Defense Minister. Minister von der Leyen.
Yes, thank you. First of all, if the first question from Russia was a question relating to the Ukraine conflict, and yes, there are severe differences between Europe, the United States, Russia, and what happened in Ukraine. But what we learned is that it was absolutely necessary to solve, in part, the conflict, to find a room for dialogue. And while finding a room where everybody could sit down at the table and start a dialogue to solve the conflict, which is the Minsk agreement, basically, this was the first step to have an improvement in that very difficult situation. This does not mean that everything is resolved so far, but we learned from that process that even if you have completely different attitudes towards specific topics, like the annexation of Crimea, for example, where we are totally different in our approaches, whether it is a right to violate international law or not, and how the historical relations have been. We were able to sit down at a negotiation table and to have the Minsk agreement and now to work through that Minsk agreement. And having that in mind, I think this might be a way to approach the humongous problems in the region, Syria and Iraq. Yesterday in Vienna, we found a room for dialogue where the different actors And this is not a ranking now when I start with the United States, Europe, Russia, Turkey, Iran, Saudi Arabia, just to name some. Of course, Iraq and Syria. If we find a room for dialogue where we can sit down, put the problems on the table, get them in a certain order, and start to talk about how to find a solution for the region. What we have learned in this region is that so many different actors are influencing the conflict in Syria and Iraq with different interests, that if you do not get everybody at the table, you will not find the main common interest, which is how to fight Daesh, or the phenomenon of Daesh, and whom to protect. And therefore, I welcome that yesterday the different 15 countries sat down and did not leave the room within minutes, but sat down for 8 or 9 hours and started a process, even if there are still differences, of course, deep differences, but they started a process of negotiation. Second question from Germany, of course the Middle East is of our great concern. Indifference is not an option, if I may say so. And yes, there was a development of looking at the region over the last years. And if I may look to the future right now, as I pointed out in my brief comments, we share core interests now, common interests. We share them what extremism is concerned, be it Daesh or be it foreign fighters or be it attacks within Europe. It's the same experience we make with extremism, and we have to share our knowledge and experience how to fight extremism at its roots. Second, because of the enormous number of refugees coming to Europe, just to give you a number, since 8 to 10 weeks, 10,000 on average a day in Germany, every single day. And when we all see those horrifying pictures of children drowning and being their dead bodies washed at our shores, we know that we have to sit down together. And this is of great concern of Germany and Europe, to find a solution over time after having defeated Daesh, how to rebuild this region. That is reconciliation between the different ethnic groups. That is stabilization. We've been talking about it 2 or 3 days ago together in Iraq. This is economic development and creating hope for the next generation, for the young people who at the moment are coming in humongous numbers to Europe, that they have a perspective in their home countries to build a future with a decent life, with respect for each other, where they can develop their own future. And that must be our common interest. Therefore, Germany is deeply involved in the Middle East region, and it is of our great concern. Finally, the influence of Iran on Iraq was the third question addressed to me. And of course, we see that there is an influence, as there are many other actors with a lot of influence in Syria and Iraq too. But if I may refer to my first answer, when we see that these different interests are there, the one and only thing we can do is sit together at a table and negotiate about a peaceful outcome. Whether we like it or not, every one of us has to put aside many complaints we have about the other. But if we continue of pointing at others, and there are many with huge differences in their interests in that region. I've counted the different countries. I told you about the different countries. If we are pointing at the others and telling them what they do wrong, and if we do not sit down and find out what is the common interest that we have and how we could find a solution for the region, things will even get worse, and we will have a failing region where Daesh will become stronger and stronger. Our common enemy, our first enemy, is Daesh. And that's what is the starting point to work on an ongoing solution in that region.
Thank you very much. Minister Al-Obeidi, you were asked a number of questions, but the two core ones were about the popular militias, their role, and also about progress in building the National Guard.
شكرا جزيلا. جوابي عن السؤال.
Thank you very much. Concerning the first question, about the US-led coalition and what was deemed as the Russian coalition, whereas in reality it is not a coalition. It was described as a coalition by the speaker. However, it's rather a self-cooperation and intelligence sharing that could contribute to offering much-needed information to the Iraqi government, which will have a great impact on targeting the different terrorist groups in Iraq and Syria. But to this day, there is no military coalition with Russia, and the only international coalition that has presence in Iraq is the international coalition that is currently operational with the approval of the Iraqi government based on its prior request. As for the second question,
you have talked about the popular support. I think that there is a confusion between popular militias and popular leagues or popular forces. So the popular forces are governmental entities related to the Iraqi Prime Minister. They have a budget, an independent budget of the government, and they work in cooperation with the Iraqi military and military forces. They have offered a lot of sacrifices and they have offered their support to the Iraqi military. On the other hand, you have the militias who are armed forces out of the control or the power of the states, and they are persecuted by the state. We refuse to allow militias to work outside of the scope of the Iraqi government. As for the National Guard, their work is legitimate, and I have to be clear about this. There's a huge conflict about the National Guard in Iraq, inside the political blocs and parties. So I think that the question of the National Guard will evolve very slowly with regard to the conflict that it entails.
Back to the floor. I noticed that the two next speakers I will call on are both from the Republic of Korea. Earlier this morning I mentioned the growing geoeconomic and geopolitical links between the Middle East and Asia, and it offers me the opportunity to remind people that I think at one point the Republic of Korea had the third largest armed contingent in Iraq. One or both of the Korean speakers might correct me if I'm wrong, but first to take the floor is Dr. Chung-Min Lee.
Thank you, John. I have one question each for the ministers. And to Minister from Germany, you made a very compelling case as to why Germany must continue to be engaged in the region. But as a democracy, you face huge hurdles. So Chancellor Merkel has made a very courageous stance on the Syrian refugee issue. But how long can Germany maintain a domestic political consensus that allows your government to move forward on a sustained fight against ISIS, but also understanding that there are huge economic and social costs of accepting more refugees into Germany and more broadly into the EU? And to the Minister from Iraq, sir, the U.S. has spent some $25 billion retraining and reformatting the Iraqi army since 2003. And with all due respect from the outside looking in, the Iraqi military has fought a very good war so far, but there are deep doubts as to how long you can continue the capacity building in the Iraqi military. So without foreign assistance, how can you assure the audience that the Iraqi military will be able to fight and to restore order in Iraq? Thank you.
Thank you. And next, Hee Kwong.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We have once had maintained the third largest army contingent in Iraq immediately after the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003. For a few years, we were there, but by the end of 2010, by that time we have withdrawn completely from Iraq. Today we are not participating in our combat against Daesh militarily, but from the humanitarian perspective, we've been contributing a lot of financial resources to the refugees and to the Iraqi government. Minister Obeidi just highlighted the importance of tackling the root causes in the fight against the Daesh in a multifaceted manner, not only militarily, but also socially, economically, ideologically. Minister, you did mention another important tool to combat Daesh, which is a political one. Reconciling Shia, Sunni, and other minority communities in Iraq cannot be overemphasized in discouraging these communal supports for Daesh. So what would you say, what would you tell us about the current status of political reform in your country? Separately, do you share your thoughts of any plan to perhaps request Russia to carry out airstrikes against Daesh targets in Iraq? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next from the UK, Zaid Belbadji.
Thank you, Sir John. The question is with regards to this conflict in particular, and the reality is that these conflicts against extremism are cyclical. This is addressed to both speakers. There is no doubt that the key political pressure points directly contribute to the growth of extremism and thereby conflicts against extremism. So what is the most urgent thing that's needed to implement a long-term solution to stop these conflicts arriving cyclically? Because there is a pattern to this. Thank you.
Sorry, just to clarify, can you describe what you think is the pattern to these cyclical conflicts?
That key political crises and pressure points cause these groups and cults like Daesh to exist, and thereby conflicts and coalitions that are needed to sort them. It's happened time and time again.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. From Bahrain, Dr. Yusuf Mashal.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My question could be for both speakers. And in the past few weeks, the geopolitics has changed in the area. What are the possible solutions you would see to the Iraqi and Syrian conflicts? Would you see actually a change in a change in the geopolitics calculus in the Middle East? And to what extent the change that happened with the Russian in Syria, it has undermined the U.S. influence in the area? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think if there are no other interventions at present, then I'll return to the panel. I might ask Minister Obeidi to take the questions first, and then Dr. Ursula van der Leyen. I might add a question to those that have just been asked to each of them. Could I ask each of them, additionally, if they might give their own perspective on what they think Russian strategy now is, not just in Syria, but generally in the region? Minister Obeidi.
Thank you. Turning to the first question about the U.S. expenditure on rebuilding the Iraqi army of approximately $25 billion, and what are the perspectives of rebuilding the Iraqi army without foreign assistance. As a matter of fact, the Iraqi army has gone through a very difficult period. The problems of June 2014, where the Iraqi army has lost much of its military capacities. Its financial capacities were as well squandered. It was a loss of approximately $27 billion. And about 5 military brigades were dismantled. As a result, the different military and political leaderships in Iraq reconsidered the best way to reconstruct the army. However, the Ministry of Defense and the higher Iraqi leaderships were faced with the lack of financial resources, especially amidst the latest crisis due to the decrease in oil prices. And it's quite difficult to rebuild an army while fighting at the same time. Currently, the Iraqi army, all of its units are engaged in operations on the ground, and we need to build new, large-scale and well-equipped forces. The U.S. assistance has a great impact and effect on rebuilding the currently available forces, of course, but without additional international aid, I think it would be quite difficult to reconstruct the army to the level that is needed, especially that we are in a state of ongoing war, where we are losing much of our resources, and it's fast training than any conventional war that we've seen in the region before. So the Iraqi army is in need of any kind of international or regional help. And to be very clear and honest, I mentioned that in my speech earlier, I truly hope that everyone becomes aware that Iraq, the Iraqi people and the Iraqi security forces are fighting terrorism on behalf of the world. This is why it's the duty of all countries of the world, especially the regional neighbors, to assist the Iraqi government in rebuilding the Iraqi army so that it would be able to undertake its missions in the current period. In spite of all of these difficulties, that being said, the Iraqi army was able to regain confidence, and it was able to restructure itself internally. The Iraqi army very recently was not able to confront the terrorist groups. Today it's fiercely fighting these terrorist groups, and it's able to halt their progress. However, it still needs the help of friendly countries and the countries of the region as a whole. The second question by the speaker from Korea. He talked about the Korean participation in Iraq and the Korean assistance at the humanitarian level to Iraq. We thank Korea for that, of course. As for the reforms that were adopted by the Iraqi government, I think these were quite impactful and important. They are under implementation, and they will have a great positive impact as well on the different economic, political and military events in Iraq. There is a great deal of acceptance of these reforms at the grassroots level. Of course, there are some obstacles, some hindrances at the level of these reforms. However, we often review them and try to adapt them as needed. Things are going as planned. In reference to requesting Russia to conduct airstrikes, to this day we have not requested that or any other type of direct military assistance. But as I've said earlier, Iraq is always in need of assistance, and assistance that comes from any country should not come linked to a specific set of conditions. We have constants that we will not let go of on Iraq, namely not interfering in the internal affairs of Iraq and respecting the solidarity and sovereignty of Iraq. If assistance respect all of that, then we commend any kind of assistance that would allow us to fight ISIS more efficiently, and this will ultimately serve the interests of the entire world in Iraq. The third question was about the geopolitical changes mentioned by Dr. Youssef Mishal. I think these are all taken into account. However, I think you mostly concentrated on the impact of the Russian interference in Syria. If the Russian interference in Syria is for the sake of combating terrorism and defeating the terrorist cells, I think it will have a great impact at the geopolitical level in the region. However, if it aims targeting other parties, I think it will have a great negative impact, especially on Iraq, as if other parties other than ISIS are going to be targeted, then this will simply reinforce ISIS, and this will have a great negative impact on Iraq. We're still waiting to assess the Russian performance in Syria, not in Iraq, and we'll take a position based on the future developments. Thank you.
Before I turn to Ursula von der Leyen, I notice there's one more comment or question from the floor, so I'll ask Alia Mubayed to pose that question or make that comment now.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Chipman. It's a question to Minister von der Leyen regarding basically one of the core interests you've emphasized. I go back to the economic issue. Clearly, I mean, the outlook for the region, presumably whether to accompany basically containing the economic cost of conflicts or planning for a post-conflict reconstruction and development period, would by all means be in very large numbers. And we all know that whether Europe or for that matter even the rich Gulf countries in the current global environment have other priorities to allocate to. And at the same time, the international organization, whether the World Bank and the IMF, have actually, to say the least, have fallen below, far behind in terms of their role in supporting the region, whether through the Arab Spring or in this period of conflict. So my question to you, given that Germany is a major stakeholder of these international institutions in particular, whether you have any particular, as part of this strategy that you've outlined, whether you have anything to share with us on how you think these international organizations, and particularly the World Bank and the IMF, should, if at all, change their approach to doing business and supporting economic prosperity and development in the region, away from conditionality and a greater understanding of the political economy and security dimension and their implication on economic development in the future.
Yeah, thank you very much. Ursula von der Leyen.
Thank you. The first question was about the refugee crisis in Europe, and the question whether how the social and economic costs are being carried by Germany and the fight against Daesh we're engaged in. Let me start with the last part. As you know, we joined from the very beginning on the coalition against terror. And we have divided our work and our fight against Daesh in different tasks. And Germany took over the task to support northern Iraq, the Kurds, the Peshmerga. And lately we have a growing cooperation with the central government, focusing on the Peshmerga and the Kurds was a double approach. Or is a double approach. On one hand, we are providing them with arms, but we are also training the troops, which show to be a very constructive way to help in the region, because the Peshmerga then were able not only to defend themselves, but also to fight back Daesh. That was the first time that there was a strong defeat of Daesh, and to show that they are able to win back territory. Second part, they were able to protect themselves, but also 1.5 million refugees they do have within the northern part of the Iraq. Therefore, we do not only support the northern part of the Iraq with arms and training, military training, but also it's the triple amount by humanitarian assistance. And by showing that the country is able, with the right amount of support and with strategic patience, to take over its own security, again, the responsibility for security is, in my view, the right approach to the problem. Second, if we look at, you said social and economic costs of the refugee coming to Germany, to Europe, let me just say a few words before I come to the cost part. We have written down in our constitution that the very first article in our constitution is that human dignity is inviolable, and a little bit later it says persons persecuted out of political reasons have to be given shelter, and this is also true for people who flee terror, war, or civil war. So we will not slam the door in the face of the refugees. This is for sure, because this is out of our whole constitutional existence. It's one of our core values to give shelter to people who really need it out of the reasons I was just quoting. This is topic number one. Topic number two is those who come for other economic reasons, for example, from the West Balkan, we send back. This is the first approach in Germany that was necessary to tell to the public that we really give shelter to those who need help, but to those who come out of economic reasons, they cannot stay in our country. Second, we need a European solution. We are 500 million Europeans, and Europe once was created to be able to solve problems that the single member state is not able to solve anymore. And if we go back to this core interest, combined with solidarity, which is not a one-way street, but solidarity means that in tough times we share burden. That is a process that Europe now has to learn what the refugees are concerned. So it is extremely important for us to learn to have a distribution process and fair burden sharing what refugees and the following costs are concerned. But I must also add, if we do it right, I mean by immediately starting to give access to language training, to give access to education, to give access to the labor market, to make sure that every refugee has to abide by the rules as every other European citizen too. If we do it right from the beginning on, we are convinced that over time it might be of benefit for both sides, because you have a huge amount of refugees coming or fleeing terror, Daesh terror, and coming with the willingness to make something out of their lives. And whether they stay forever or whether they go back home to Syria and Iraq. The moment we invest in their education and in their ability to get integrated, they will develop a entrepreneurship and a willingness to be of benefit for the country, or to bring back the knowledge they got to their home countries when it's time to go back again, when there's peace again, where we all will benefit out of it. And this is the reason why we do that the way we do it. Third point, of course, we have to make sure that in the refugee camps, in Turkey and Jordan and Lebanon, conditions are decent. We all know that at the beginning of the year, the World Food Programme and the UNHCR had about $30 per refugee per month. In summer, because the World Food Programme did not have enough money anymore, it had to be cut down to $13.50 per refugee per month in the refugee camps. And you can imagine that if the pressure gets too high, the pain is too strong, people just take their children and leave. And therefore, the third step following the domestic and the European part is taking care of the refugee camps. This is not only a German task, it's a task for the whole world, that the UNHCR and the World Food Programme is financed, but we have to insist on it. And the fourth, and you might put it as the first task, is of course to ask for the root causes, why people leave their country. Nobody leaves its country, his country or her country, deliberately if they do not have to. And this is, of course, then we're back to the origin of our discussion. This is, of course, the terror, the war, the civil war, and the terror of Daesh in Syria and Iraq we have to fight. Second question was about, I have to get my papers right, the pattern of conflicts. There are certainly many reasons for the type of conflicts we see, but one pattern I see is a lack, if you have a lack of inclusiveness in the government, this is the breeding soil for extremism to grow. If you have a group that seems to be excluded within a country, within a population, this is the ground where extremism can grow. And therefore the goal must be to reinstall and to encourage an inclusive government. That's one of the reasons why we share a lot with the Iraq central government, because I highly honor and appreciate the approach to have a Sunni, a Shia, a Kurd part within the government, as difficult as it is, and I feel it every time when I'm there. But I have high respect for the daily struggle to find a common ground, to find a unanimous approach towards the problems that are in the country. That is inclusiveness as it should be, knowing that it is difficult. Third question was about Russia and the coalition. Well, I can add to your words, dear colleague. You know, when Russia announced it would enter the conflict to fight Daesh, ISIS, we applauded. What we saw was around about 20% of the airstrikes went against Daesh, 80% were other goals, they were aiming at different groups. To be honest, it was the same with Turkey. When Turkey announced that they would enter the fight against ISIS, we applauded. But it was highly irritating when we saw that many airstrikes were directed against the PKK. I do not take the part of the PKK because the PKK has a extremist branch that was violently attacking Turkish soldiers, but still we need to find a minimal consensus whom to fight and whom to protect in that region. I can only repeat that. And then to end that thought, of course there is, I think, in the Russian strategy, in the region, of course, part is power projection. There's a strong part of having influence, taking influence, and keeping influence, Latakia. But there is also the fear of Daesh, because this kind of extremism is a strong threat for Russia and in Russia too. So if we keep that in mind, we might find an approach how to communicate with each other. Last but not least, the last question was post-conflict scenario. I cannot speak for the IMF, but when I started to say we need, or when we see the source for these conflicts, the pattern behind it is often a lack of an inclusive government. Well, the second source for these conflicts is poverty, unemployment, frustration, not having part in developing the country. So the post-conflict scenario will have two main tasks. The one is, of course, allocate money to rebuild the economy, to have jobs, to have access to education, to have access to prosperity, because everyone in the room knows that prosperity is the precondition for security, and security is the precondition for prosperity. So those two things, if we invest in this area, it's a good investment because we get peace and stability out of it. And the second task that we will face is reconciliation. We have been talking with your president, Massoum, about the day after you fought, or you were able to get a city back from Daesh. The day after, the real work begins, because it's the work of reconciliation. There have been enormous conflicts between neighbors when Daesh entered the scene. There has been betrayal. There is a huge amount of revenge in the room. And we know from our history what it means. If after a long time you have a reconciliation again, you have to work a lot on moderation, on saying aloud what happened, not hiding it, but then trying not to deepen the wounds, but to find a common road for the future. So economy and reconciliation will be the main task, and if we can help, it is a noble task to help.
Well, thank you very much indeed. I think in the last hour and 15 minutes we've heard superb analysis, strong strategic thinking, clear policy statements, and I think also a great expression of political leadership. So if it is sometimes difficult to create a sense of optimism out of the tragedies and challenges that this region confronts, I think the bold leadership that both of our speakers this afternoon have sought to give expression to gives us some hope for the future, if that kind of leadership is the type that governs the way in which nations, states, and alliances operate. We've had a very full day. We began at 9. We're finishing at 5:15, as I promised. I want to thank you all for a very invigorating day, and I hope that all of you will thank our two speakers for their splendid contributions to our debate. Perfect. Could I remind everybody that we convene tomorrow morning at 9:30 for 4 special sessions on the future of Yemen, GCC defense posture and external powers, stabilizing weak states, the role of political Islamism, and then we have a 5th plenary session on managing conflict spillover. So have a good dinner, rest well tonight,